Lab with Professor Lynn Dix, which is the same lab that Sophia also works in. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my research, about how honeybees and wild bumblebees share landscapes, and specifically how I'm trying to answer this question. So, as you may know, insects are in decline worldwide and also in the UK. And if we look just at bumblebee numbers, they're really declining quite dramatically. For example, last year we had huge declines in many species, such as the red-tailed bumblebee, which is 72% down from the year before, the tree bumblebee, which was 41% down, and the white-tailed bumblebee, which was just over half less than the year before, which is really concerning. So the reasons why they're declining are numerous. One of them is due to climate change, causing differences in weather patterns, such as wetter springs, which can lead to the bumblebee nests getting waterlogged and therefore not succeeding, or having really hot summers, which the bumblebees can't really deal with that well. So when they're trying to keep their nest warm, they're also trying to keep it cool when it gets too hot. Another reason why they're declining is pesticides. So pesticides can cause direct mortality to the bees because they are designed to kill pest insects, but they also affect beneficial insects like bees. But they can also have sublethal effects, which means that if the bees come into contact with them, their normal behaviors can be disrupted. We also have a huge problem of habitat loss. In the UK, for example, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows since the 1940s, which is a huge amount. That's almost all of them. And bees rely on these as resources for pollen and also for nectar. And pesticide use and climate change also feed into habitat loss, because pesticides also include herbicides, which can affect flower species. And we also have climate change that can alter how different plants respond to the weather, for example. If it's too dry, they might not succeed. If it's too wet, they might also not succeed. So this really disrupts the ecosystem. But what I focus on is how the added potential stressor of having lots of honeybees in the landscape could be affecting bees in addition to all of these others. So especially since the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in people keeping bees. And it's kind of thought that maybe this isn't a great thing for other bees because they'll be going to the same flowers and maybe competing for resources. So my research focuses on how do these managed honeybees and wild bumblebees share the landscape. So first I have a question for you all. Are there any ways in which you can think that different bee species are sharing the landscape? Nobody? All right, I'll go straight in. So they share resources, including pollen and nectar. They also can have shared nesting sites. For example, cavities in trees. So honeybees are cavity nesting in the wild, even though most of the time they live in beehives. But some bumblebees also nest in cavities, so they could compete for those. They also have lots of shared parasites and diseases that once they visit the same flowers, they can pass on to each other. And my research focuses only on this part. So keep in mind that this is only a very small part of the story. So you've all already seen what the bumblebee life cycle is, but I'll just refresh your memory. So the queens emerge and search for a nest site in spring. Then they start their pollen ball with the first brood, also in the spring. Then in the summer, just as a fun fact, a new bumblebee takes about a month to emerge from being laid as an egg. So it's a really long phase in which they're in the brood ball, which is potentially a period in their life cycle where they're really vulnerable. And then in the summer, they grow their colony. And then at the end of the summer, the old queen dies, the new queens and the males come out and they will mate. And then the new queens that have mated will go into hibernation again in the soil. But all of this does not happen in isolation. In a lab setting, it would be just this life cycle that they need to worry about, but they're also in a wider landscape. And each landscape has their own set of plants that are available to them. And the quantity and the quality of those can affect each of these different steps in the bumblebee life cycle. There could also be honeybee hives in this landscape of varying densities. So there could be some areas with really high numbers and some with really low ones. And this is exactly what I'm interested in, is what happens when there's lots of honeybees and how do they share these floral resources with each other. And I'm specifically interested in this stage in their life cycle in the late summer, because in the late summer you have something which is called the summer gap, where there's a lack of floral resources available just due to the way that the plants go throughout the year. So just imagine we have this hypothetical landscape with all of these plants and flowers available to both the bumblebees and the honeybees. So you can imagine that the honeybees maybe have a preference for all of these species, and the bumblebees might like a different set of flowers for their diet. And you can see that sometimes they like the same plants. So what happens if you have a really high density of honeybees? The theory is that maybe that could change the way that the bumblebees are using the landscape. So there's a few differences between honeybees and bumblebees that are important in this question. So honeybees are generalists. That means that they will go to lots of different flower species for food. They also use recruitment foraging, which is when a honeybee finds a really nice patch of flowers, they'll go back to the hive and they'll do a waggle dance, which tells the other bees the quality and the direction and the location of this really good flower patch. And so if the bees are convinced by the dancing, they'll actually go back to that same flower patch to also eat from the same flowers. So if they find a good spot, they'll all go to that spot, whereas bumblebees don't do that. They also fly up to 3 kilometers around their nest to find food, which is quite far. Bumblebees, so the one that I'm looking at, is also a generalist. They are also buzz pollinators, which means that they can access certain pollen from certain flowers by buzzing and biting on the flower, which honeybees can't do. And they also do something called nectar robbing, where they will bite into the flower to access the nectar, which honeybees don't do, but they will use the holes that the bumblebees have made. They also have a way smaller area that they use to forage in. So I was really interested in how two different species in the same location would use the same resources that are available to them. So to do this, I got some bumblebee colonies. This is what they look like when they're about 2 weeks old. And there's about 40 bees in this colony, also including a queen. So I placed these out into the Cambridgeshire landscape in apiaries around Cambridgeshire. And I left them there for about a month and a half. So after being left out, this is what that looks like. So this is all that colony growth that you could see from the bumblebee life cycle. Also, interestingly, they cover a lot of their nest with wax to keep it nice and warm. And they also have some toilet corners that they use to put all of their debris in, and they go there to poo. So it's a really fun way to look at a bumblebee nest. So this is about 8 weeks old, and in this picture there are about 143 bees. So what I did is I placed these into these colony boxes to protect them from the weather, from the rain, from the heat and the cold, and also from badgers that will find these and try to get in. So to find out how they're actually using the floral resources in the landscape, I fitted them with pollen traps, which are these white things, and here's a close-up, where basically they have to go through a constricted entrance with these little scrapey bits, and they squeeze through, and the pollen gets scraped off of their corbicula, which you heard about in Sophia's talk, and it falls through this kind of cattle grid into a collection basket, and then I collect that and do some analysis. So I didn't only do this for the bumblebee colonies, but also one honeybee colony in each apiary, so that I could compare what they brought back to the nest. So that's what this looks like for a honeybee colony. You have the same kind of trap system with these holes that they have to squeeze through, and then these pollen baskets get scraped off and they fall through this grid into a collection basket. So I want to ask you, do you think that this came from a honeybee colony or a bumblebee colony? This is all pollen.
Honeybee?
Yeah, that's correct. So honeybee colonies are really big. They have tens of thousands of bees, whereas bumblebee colonies can have up to 500. So this is a huge amount of pollen collected by lots of bees over the course of 3 days. So in the same location and during the same time frame, a bumblebee colony collected this amount of pollen, which is really quite low. But you can see that not all of the pollen was scraped off by this dust that's here. And that's bees that were small enough to crawl through those holes and still keep their pollen bags. So these bigger ones are probably from bigger bumblebees. And this wet stuff is probably nectar that they regurgitated to make themselves smaller to fit through the hole. So it's a bit of a mix of everything. So as you can see, the pollen has different colors. That's because the pollen from different plants can look different. So the brown is probably bramble, the purple is probably phacelia. So each different plant can have a slightly differently colored pollen, and that's also how we can analyze whether they go to the same or different plants for their food. So slugs also really love pollen. As you can see, they've been eating all of the samples, and you can also tell by the color of their poo. That's pollen colored, so I know where my samples went. That was last year when we had a lot of slugs. So anyone who has a garden might know that there was just way too many slugs that year. So this is what that looks like. So from each bag of pollen that I collect, which is a lot, I'll take a small sample, and then I divide it into colors so that the identification of what plants these came from is a bit easier for me. So in this sample, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different color categories. But actually, depending on the lighting, these might still contain different colors that I just can't see. And so this is a honeybee sample, but a bumblebee sample looks like this. And it's a lot more difficult to analyze because different pollen baskets contain different colors. So it's really difficult to separate. And it also shows that bumblebees go to different plants in one visit. So that's different to honeybees. They'll tend to go to one type of plant per foraging visit. So I took all of these samples to a lab. This was my lab setup. So I used something which is called a pipette. And this is where I throw away all of the very toxic dye that I use to color the pollen away safely. So I took all those different colors and I mixed it with ethanol, which is alcohol, to make these kind of like forbidden Fanta smoothies. And you can see that they're all slightly different colors, but they're all from the same colony. And so I put those onto slides with that dye that I mentioned, which is called fuchsine dye, and it dyes it all purple. So these are all the slides that I then put into a microscope, and I took pictures of those, and it kind of looks like this through a microscope. So this is 400 magnification. So you can't really see this with the naked eye. Sometimes you can if the pollen is really big. You can see the individual pollen grains, but you can't see all this detail. So this is a sample from a honeybee colony, which looks quite uniform, but there's still different types of pollen grains. And this is the one from a bumblebee colony. And you can already immediately see that it's a lot messier, kind of similar to how they manage their nest. And you can see that there's also lots of different pollen types in there. And sometimes you'll also see something that's not a pollen grain. This is a thrips, which has gotten into the sample and also has eaten some of my pollen. So that's a general theme when you're trying to analyze pollen. Slugs, thrips, they all get to it. So what does that actually look like from one site for the 2 different colonies? So here I'm showing you a graph with 3 different sampling periods. So I took the pollen from these colonies for 3 days at a time every other week. So for three times I did that. So 1, 2, and 3. And then I had samples from bumblebees and honeybees for each of the 3 sampling periods. And this just shows that in that same location, they're actually using different pollen resources. So for example, the bumblebees, let me just zoom in on them. If we're just looking at the purple for a minute, this was mostly Phacelia, which is a really favorite plant for bees in general. That's this plant. And farmers use it as a cover crop. And there was also some poppy. And there was some pollen from lime trees. And I found a picture from that sample for you to look at. These ones that kind of look like peppermints are all the Phacelias. This one in the middle is a lime pollen grain. And then if we look at the honeybees from that same time, you can see that actually they are also using this purple, but way less of it is represented in their diet for this 1 week. They also really like this gray, which I haven't identified yet. But if we look at just the purple again, you can see that it's also Phacelia, and also a little bit of Brassicaceae, so that's from the cabbage family. And I found another photo for you from that same sample. And this one is the Brassicaceae pollen, and these again are those peppermint ones. So, some conclusions about how they share resources. First of all, they have different foraging strategies and abilities, as I explained before, and we can also see that they're going to different plants, even though they have the same ones available to them. And so what I want to find out next is, does this change when there are more honeybees in the landscape? And also, can we see fitness effects from how much they're overlapping in the different types of plants that they're using? And that's all for my talk, so thank you for listening. And thank you to my collaborators, Sarah, Tim, and the CBKA beekeepers.